My name is Frank Peterson. I'm 54 years old, and for 28 of those years, I worked as a timber cruiser, mostly in the northern half of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. It's a job that means you spend your days alone, or with one other guy, deep in the woods, walking grids, marking trees, estimating board feet. You get to know the woods, not like a hiker on a trail, but intimately. You know its sounds, its smells, the way the light changes by the hour. You learn to read the silence. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that I'm not some city kid who got spooked by an owl. I'm a man who spent the better part of his life in the forest, and I thought I knew what was in it. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you happened 8 years ago in a remote block of hardwoods deep in the Manistee National Forest. I've only ever told 2 other people the full story. One was my wife, who believes me but wishes I'd forget. The other was a sheriff's deputy who looked at me like I was insane. So I stopped talking. But I'm getting older now, and the memory doesn't fade. It gets sharper, and I feel like I have to, bear witness, put it on the record, so to speak, because what happened to my partner, Dave, shouldn't happen to anyone. And it happened because we made a mistake born of pity. Before I get into what happened, if you're new here, consider subscribing. I share stories like this regularly. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I always like to know who's listening. All right, let me tell you what happened up near the Manistee. The job was a standard contract. A private lumber company had leased a few hundred acres of mixed maple, oak, and birch from the state, and our job was to mark the harvestable timber. It was late October. The air was crisp. The leaves were past their peak, but still clinging on, covering the forest floor in a crunchy, rust-colored carpet. It's my favorite time of year to be in the woods. The bugs are gone, the air is clean, and you can see for a good distance through the understory. We were working a section that was miles from any paved road, accessed by a series of increasingly rough 2-tracks that were more mud than gravel. Because the commute was so long, the company had rented a small hunting cabin for us to use for the 2 weeks the job was supposed to take. It was primitive, no electricity, just a propane tank for the stove, and a noisy generator out back for a few hours of light at night. A hand pump well for water that tasted like iron. It was situated in a small clearing, surrounded by a dense wall of trees. It wasn't much, but it was dry, and it beat driving 3 hours every day. My partner on that job was Dave Miller. He was young, maybe 25, full of that kind of earnest energy that I'd long since lost. He was a good kid, a hard worker, but he was green. He saw the woods as this beautiful, romantic place. I saw it as a workplace, a place you had to respect because it didn't respect you back. Our days fell into a simple, comfortable rhythm. Up before dawn, the air sharp and cold enough to see your breath inside the cabin. I'd get the coffee percolating on the propane stove while Dave wrestled with the generator to get it started. We'd eat oatmeal, pack sandwiches and thermoses, and be out in the woods by first light. We'd work our grid lines with compass and map, calling out measurements, the sound of the paint gun marking trees the loudest noise for miles. Then, back at dusk, exhausted, muddy, and hungry. We'd have a simple dinner, maybe play a few hands of cribbage, and be in our bunks by 9. It was a peaceful existence. For the first 3 days, it was perfect. The weather held, we were making good progress, and the solitude was restorative. But on the 4th day, something changed. It wasn't a big thing. It was a small thing. A quiet thing. It started in the morning. When I stepped out of the cabin with my coffee, the air felt heavy. That's the only word for it. Usually, a fall morning in the woods is a symphony of noise. Blue jays squawking, squirrels chattering and rustling in the leaf litter, the distant drumming of a woodpecker. But that morning, there was nothing. Absolute, total silence. Not a peaceful silence. It was a thick, pressurized silence, like the world was holding its breath. I remember standing on the rickety porch, scanning the tree line and feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. Every instinct I had, honed by decades of being out here, was screaming that something was wrong. Dave came out a minute later, stretching and yawning. He said something like, "Quiet morning, huh?" I just nodded. I didn't want to spook him. Inside, my brain was running through the possibilities. A big predator moving through? A bobcat, maybe a black bear. They can quiet a patch of woods, sure, but not like this. Not this complete and utter void of sound. We headed out to our grid line for the day, and the feeling didn't go away. The silence followed us. The only sounds were our own footsteps crunching in the leaves and the hiss of the paint gun. It was unnerving. The forest felt like a stage, and we were the only actors on it, under a spotlight we couldn't see. I kept finding myself stopping, listening, scanning the trees around us. I felt watched. It was a tangible, physical sensation, like a weight on my shoulders. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, the isolation getting to me, but I couldn't shake it. Around noon, we stopped for lunch by a small, gurgling creek. We sat on a fallen log, eating our sandwiches without much conversation. The silence was starting to get to Dave, too. He kept glancing around nervously. He finally broke the quiet. "You think a wolf pack moved in?" he asked, his voice a little too loud. I told him it was possible, but we hadn't seen any tracks, no scat. A wolf pack makes its presence known. This was different. This was an absence. He tried to make a joke. "Maybe it's Bigfoot," he said with a nervous laugh. I didn't laugh back. I just told him to keep his eyes open. That afternoon, we found the tracks. They weren't near our grid, but in a damp, mossy hollow we had to cross. At first glance, they looked like prints from a huge dog or a wolf, but as I knelt down to get a closer look, the inconsistencies started to pile up. The print was too long, too narrow. The heel pad was more pronounced, more human-like, and the stride. It was immense. I measured it with my tape. Nearly 6 feet between prints, and they were bipedal, 2 feet. Whatever made these was walking on 2 legs. Dave saw my face. "What is it?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. I pointed at the tracks. I said, "It's a bear, a big one, walking on its hind legs for a bit." It was a lie, and we both knew it. A bear doesn't walk on 2 legs for a quarter mile through dense woods. The gait is all wrong. But it was the only explanation my brain could latch onto, the only box I could try to force it into. The real explanation was unthinkable. We finished the day in a state of high alert, getting back to the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that felt mocking in their beauty. The silence was still there, a constant, oppressive blanket. That night, as we sat in the dim light of the propane lantern, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. It felt like the cabin wasn't a shelter, but a cage, and something was just outside, observing us. The next day, the 5th day, was the day everything went to hell. The silence was still there when we woke up. It had become the new normal. We were jumpy, our conversation clipped and functional. We decided to work a grid closer to the cabin, a subconscious need to stay near our only sanctuary. We were moving through a thicket of young hemlocks around mid-morning when we heard it. A whimper. It was faint, a high-pitched, distressed sound. It sounded like a puppy,
Dave stopped dead. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I had. My first thought was, it's a trap. A coyote, maybe, caught in a snare. We moved toward the sound cautiously. It led us to a small, eroded gully, and there, at the bottom, was the source of the noise. At first glance, it looked like a German shepherd puppy, maybe 4 or 5 months old. It was covered in dark, matted fur, and one of its back legs was bent at a sickeningly unnatural angle, caught in the rusted jaws of an old, forgotten leg-hold trap. It was whimpering pitifully, its whole body trembling. Dave's heart immediately went out to it. "The poor thing," he said, already starting to slide down the side of the gully. I grabbed his arm. "Dave, wait."
Something's not right. Think about it. Where's its mother? We're miles from any house. This isn't a stray dog. He looked at me, his face a mixture of pity and annoyance. "We can't just leave it here to die, Frank. That's cruel." I knew he was right on a human level, but on a survival level, every alarm in my head was ringing. I looked closer at the creature. The whimpering had stopped, and it was watching us now. Its eyes. They weren't dog eyes. They were too far forward in its skull, too intelligent. The color was a strange, pale yellow, almost amber, and as it shifted its weight, I saw its front paws. They weren't paws. They had long, slender digits like fingers, tipped with thick, black claws. The proportions were all wrong. The forelimbs were too long for its body. The elbows seemed to bend in a way that was subtly but disturbingly incorrect. It looked like a clumsy, first draft attempt at making a dog, put together by someone who'd only had the general shape described to them. "It's not a dog, Dave," I said, my voice low. "I don't know what it is, but we need to leave it." But Dave was already at the bottom of the gully, talking to it in a soft, soothing voice. "It's okay, little fella. We're gonna help you." The creature just watched him, its head cocked to one side. It didn't growl or snap. It just watched. Dave managed to work the trap open, his hands gentle. The creature let out a sharp yelp of pain when the pressure was released, then licked at its mangled leg. It made no move to run. It just looked up at Dave, expectantly. He looked back at me, his eyes pleading. "We can take it back to the cabin, splint its leg. We can call animal control in the morning." I argued against it. I told him it was a profoundly bad idea. I said its mother had to be close and she wasn't going to be happy. He was insistent. He said his conscience wouldn't let him leave it. In the end, I gave in. It was the single worst decision of my life. Dave carefully wrapped the creature in his flannel jacket, cradling it like a baby. It was eerily compliant. As he carried it up out of the gully, I stood guard, scanning the silent woods around us, my hand resting on the handle of the hatchet on my belt. The feeling of being watched had intensified 1,000 times. It was no longer a vague premonition. It was a certainty. We were being hunted. Getting back to the cabin was the longest walk of my life. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. Dave was focused on the injured creature in his arms, murmuring to it. I felt like we had a giant flashing neon sign over our heads that said, "Pray." We got inside and bolted the door. The immediate sense of relief was quickly replaced by a new kind of tension. We now had this thing inside with us. Dave laid it gently on a blanket near the wood stove. We found an old dog crate in the shed, and after some coaxing, the creature limped inside. Dave splinted its leg as best he could with some kindling and medical tape from our first aid kit. The whole time, it was calm, watching his every move with those intelligent yellow eyes. Once it was settled in the crate, a strange quiet fell over the cabin.
We had crossed a line, and we both knew it. We had interfered. We tried to go about our evening routine, but the atmosphere was thick with dread. We ate our dinner of canned stew in silence, the only sounds the ticking of my watch and the occasional soft whimper from the crate. As darkness fell, a heavy, wet fog rolled in, pressing against the cabin windows and swallowing the clearing. It muffled the world, making our little box feel even more isolated. The generator chugged away, a lonely mechanical heartbeat in the oppressive quiet. Around 8 p.m., the generator sputtered and died. We'd forgotten to refill the gas. Suddenly, the cabin was plunged into absolute darkness, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical blow.
I fumbled for a flashlight, its beam cutting a nervous path through the black. We lit a couple of propane lanterns, and their hissing glow cast long, dancing shadows on the wood-paneled walls. The cabin felt smaller, more vulnerable. That's when we heard the first sound from outside. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the cabin. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a wolf. It was deeper, more resonant. It was a sound of pure territorial rage. The creature in the crate began to whine, a high, frantic sound, a direct response. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the main window, peering out into the foggy darkness. I couldn't see anything but swirling gray mist. Then the smell hit me. It seeped through the cracks in the walls, a foul, overpowering stench of wet fur, rotting meat, and something else. A coppery, metallic smell, like old blood. It was the smell of a predator, a carnivore, and it was close. Dave was frozen, his face pale in the lantern light. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I just whispered for him to kill the lanterns. He did, and we were once again in the dark, save for the weak beam of my flashlight. We stood there, barely breathing, listening. For a long minute, there was nothing. Then, a heavy thump against the far wall of the cabin, as if something massive had leaned against it. We both jumped. Then we heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Not the 4-footed scramble of a bear, but the 2-footed, rhythmic tread of something walking. It was circling the cabin. Slowly, methodically. The floorboards of the porch groaned under an immense weight. The creature in the crate was going insane now, scratching at the door and letting out a series of yips and cries. From outside, right next to the door, came an answering sound. A series of low clicks and a soft, throaty chuff. It was communicating with its young. A cold, horrifying realization washed over me. This wasn't just an angry animal. This was a parent looking for its child. And we were the kidnappers. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the door. There was a sniffing sound, loud and wet. Then, a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. The metallic scrape of a claw on the doorknob, followed by the distinct sound of the knob turning. It was testing the door. It knew what a door was. It knew how it worked. This wasn't an animal. This was a monster with intelligence. I grabbed the heavy wooden table we used for eating and shoved it against the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Dave, help me," I hissed. He snapped out of his trance and helped me wedge it securely. The thing outside let out a frustrated roar, a sound of such volume and fury that the windows rattled in their frames. It wasn't a sound of this earth. It was a nightmare given voice. It abandoned the door and moved to the nearest window. We heard its claws, thick as pencils, scraping against the glass. A moment later, its face appeared, pressed against the pane, illuminated in the fog-diffused moonlight. My mind simply refused to process what I was seeing. It was a wolf's head,
but impossibly large, perched atop a pair of broad, powerful shoulders. The fur was dark and shaggy, slick with moisture. But the eyes, they were glowing. Not a reflection like a cat's. They were generating their own faint, malevolent yellow light. They stared into the cabin, past the dark, and I just knew, they could see us perfectly. Its lips curled back, revealing a row of long, yellow fangs, and it let out a low, rumbling growl, fogging the glass with its breath. The peak of terror is a strange thing. It's not screaming. It's a moment of absolute, frozen clarity. In that moment, I saw our deaths. I saw this thing tearing the cabin apart, board by board, to get to us. And I knew we had to get out.
The decision was made in an instant. There was no other choice. Stay here and die, or run and have a chance. The creature at the window drew back and then slammed its shoulder into the wall with incredible force. The whole cabin shook. Pictures fell off the walls. It was going to tear its way in. "The back window!" I yelled at Dave, my voice cracking. "Go! To the truck!" The truck was our only hope. A 30-year-old Ford F-150 parked about 40 yards from the cabin. It might as well have been on the moon. The plan was insane, but it was the only plan we had. While the creature was focused on the front of the cabin, we scrambled to the back bedroom. The window was small, but big enough to climb through. I grabbed the fire axe that was mounted by the wood stove. It felt ridiculously small and useless in my hand. Dave grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the kitchen, his knuckles white. The creature hit the front wall again. A loud crack echoed through the cabin as a stud splintered. We didn't have much time. I used the butt of the axe to smash the window pane. The sound of shattering glass was shockingly loud in the night. For a moment, all sound from outside stopped. A dead, listening silence. Then, a new roar, this one filled with a new kind of fury. It knew what we were doing. "Go, Dave, now!" I shoved him toward the opening. He scrambled through, cutting his hand on a shard of glass, and dropped to the muddy ground outside. I was right behind him. The cold, foggy air was a shock after the stuffy cabin. We were exposed. We ran. My lungs burned, my boots slipped in the mud. The 40 yards to the truck stretched into an eternity. Behind us, I heard a tremendous crash of splintering wood. It was through. It was coming. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw it. It burst from the side of the cabin, moving with a terrifying, loping gait on two legs. It was impossibly fast, covering the ground in huge, powerful strides, its long arms swinging. In the moonlight, it looked like something ripped from the pages of a medieval bestiary. Panic gave me a new burst of speed. I fumbled in my pocket for the keys, my fingers numb and clumsy. The truck loomed ahead of us, a dark metal savior. Dave reached it a second before I did, yanking on the passenger door handle. It was locked. "Keys," he screamed, his voice thin with terror. I finally got them out. My hand was shaking so violently I could barely fit the key in the lock. The creature was closing in. I could hear its guttural breathing, smell its foul stench. The key turned. I threw the door open, shoved Dave in, and scrambled behind the wheel. I slammed the door and hit the locks just as the creature slammed into the side of the truck. The entire vehicle rocked violently on its suspension, and a huge dent blossomed in the passenger door, right where Dave's head was. A spiderweb of cracks appeared on his window. It let out a frustrated shriek and began clawing at the metal, the sound of nails on a chalkboard magnified 1,000 times. I jammed the key in the ignition. The old engine turned over once, twice. My heart stopped. "Come on, you bastards, start," I pleaded. On the third try, the engine roared to life. I threw the truck into reverse, stomping on the gas. The tires spun in the mud, then caught. As we shot backward, the creature lunged, swiping at the rear window with a clawed hand. The glass didn't shatter, but a network of deep, parallel gouges appeared, obscuring the view. I spun the wheel, put it in drive, and floored it. We fishtailed down the rutted two-track, branches scraping against the sides of the truck. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I just drove, my foot pressed to the floor, my eyes locked on the narrow tunnel of trees illuminated by my headlights. We drove like that for what felt like hours, not slowing down until the dirt track met a gravel county road, and the gravel road met paved asphalt. Only then did I allow myself to ease up on the accelerator. Only then did we allow ourselves to breathe. We drove straight to the nearest town of any size, which was about 40 miles away. We didn't talk. We just sat in the cab of the truck, the heater blasting, both of us shaking uncontrollably. The sun was just starting to tint the eastern sky gray when we pulled into the parking lot of the county sheriff's department. We must have looked a sight. Covered in mud, glass fragments in our hair, Dave bleeding from the cut on his hand. I looked at the dented, scratched-up truck and knew we couldn't tell the truth. No one would ever believe us. We agreed on a story. A bear, a massive, unnaturally aggressive black bear, had tried to get into the cabin. It had trapped us inside, and we'd had to make a run for the truck. It was a flimsy story, but it was the only one that wouldn't get us thrown in a padded room. The deputy on duty was a young guy with a tired face. He listened to our story with a patient, skeptical expression. He took our statements separately. He asked why we didn't have a rifle with us. I told him we were timber cruisers, not hunters. He made some notes, told us he'd send a conservation officer out to the cabin in the morning to check it out, and suggested we get a motel room and some sleep. Sleep was impossible. We got a cheap room on the edge of town and just sat there, the television on but the sound off, watching the morning light fill the room. The adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a deep, bone-aching exhaustion and a gnawing fear that was now a permanent part of me. Later that morning, my boss from the lumber company called. The sheriff had contacted him. Our job was suspended until the situation was sorted out. He told us to stay put.
Around noon, the same deputy called and asked us to come back down to the station. When we got there, an older, sterner-looking officer was with him, the sheriff. He said the conservation officer had been to the cabin. The damage was extensive, he said, consistent with a large bear. He looked at us, his eyes hard. But there were some things that didn't add up. The tracks around the cabin, he said, were all jumbled, but some of them didn't look right for a bear. And the gouges on my truck, they were too deep, too uniform. He asked us again, what really happened out there? Dave started to crack. He was younger, and the trauma was hitting him harder. He started rambling about the pup, about the creature's eyes, about the way it tried the doorknob. He sounded unhinged. I could see the sheriff's expression shift from suspicion to a kind of clinical pity. He thought Dave was in shock, hallucinating. I cut him off. I told the sheriff we were exhausted and scared, and that maybe Dave was confused. It was a big bear, I insisted, the biggest I've ever seen. The sheriff stared at me for a long time. Then he sighed. All right, he said, we're officially listing it as an aggressive bear encounter, but there's one more thing. He hesitated, looking from me to Dave. The officer found something at the scene. It was disturbing. He said, about 50 yards from the cabin, nailed to an oak tree with a rusty spike, they found a piece of flesh. He described it. It was a tongue, a large animal tongue, maybe from a deer. It was a message, he said, probably from local poachers trying to scare us off their territory. That was his explanation, but I knew better. I knew what the message was. It wasn't, get out. It was, give it back. That was the end for Dave. The company gave us both 2 weeks' pay and sent us home. Dave packed his bags that night and left. He told me he was going back home to Ohio. He couldn't handle the woods anymore. I never saw him again. Not in person.
I tried to move on. I took a different job, one that kept me closer to town. But I couldn't forget. About a year later, I got a call from a mutual friend. He asked if I'd heard about Dave. I said no. He told me Dave had been struggling. He'd become obsessed with what happened. He was drinking heavily, telling anyone who would listen his crazy story about the thing in the woods. He'd lost his job, his girlfriend. He was convinced that we had done something terrible, that we had broken some ancient law of the forest, and that the creature was still suffering because of its lost child. According to our friend, Dave had bought a bunch of camping gear and told his roommate he was going back to Michigan. He was going to find the creature. He was going to apologize. They found his empty campsite 2 weeks later. A few weeks after that, a hunter found his body.
The official report said he was killed and partially consumed by a bear.
But our friend had spoken to a cousin of his who was a state trooper involved in the recovery. The official report was a sanitized version. The trooper said he'd never seen an animal attack like it. And there was something else. Something they kept out of the papers. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up as he told me over the phone. They found Dave's tongue nailed to a tree a few feet from his body. The years since have been quiet on the outside. I work at a lumber yard now, in town. I like the noise of the saws, the smell of fresh-cut pine. It's predictable, controlled. I haven't been deep in the woods since that day. I can't. When I get too far from a road, I start to feel it. That silence. That feeling of being watched. My wife is patient with me. She knows I carry something heavy from that time, even if she doesn't fully understand the shape of it.
The nightmares are less frequent now, but they still come. In them, I'm always back in that cabin, watching that yellow-eyed face in the window. Or I'm running toward the truck, the sound of those heavy bipedal footfalls right behind me. Sometimes I dream of Dave, of his earnest, pity-filled face as he insisted on helping that creature. The guilt is a constant companion. If I had been stronger, if I had refused to let him bring it back to the cabin, he would still be alive. He died because of a moment of compassion, a good impulse in the face of something that operates on rules far older and more brutal than our own. I've spent hours online, in the dead of night, searching. You find things if you look. Fringe websites, forums filled with stories like mine. They call it the Michigan Dogman. Most of the stories are obvious hoaxes, campfire tales. But some of them have the ring of truth. They talk about the silence, the bipedal tracks, the intelligent glowing eyes.
They're told by hunters, loggers, people like me who know the woods and saw something that didn't belong. It's a cold comfort knowing I'm not the only one, but it doesn't make it any less terrifying. It just confirms that the world is not the safe, orderly place we pretend it is. There are cracks in the map, places where the old things still roam. We built our civilization on a thin crust, and sometimes, if you go deep enough into the wild places, you can feel that crust start to buckle under your feet. We took its child. It's that simple. We didn't see a child. We saw a monster, a curiosity. But it saw its offspring, and it came for it. And when it couldn't get it back, it delivered a judgment on Dave. A terrible, biblical kind of justice. I'm telling this story now because I need to, because the weight of it is too much to carry alone in the dark anymore. And I'm telling it as a warning. Not some dramatic stay out of the woods warning.
The woods are beautiful, and most of the time, they are exactly what they seem. But you need to listen, not with your ears, but with your gut. With that ancient part of your brain that still remembers being prey. If you're out there, far from any road, and the world suddenly goes quiet, don't get curious. Don't try to find the reason. Turn around and walk away. Don't run, just walk. Get back to your car. Get back to the noise and the light. And if you ever find an animal that looks hurt, but something about it feels wrong, if the proportions are strange or the eyes seem too smart, leave it be. You are not its savior. You are an intruder in a world you don't understand, governed by laws you can't comprehend. Pity is a human emotion. It has no place out there, in the deep woods where the old things still hold sway. Dave learned that. I learned it. His mistake was born from the best part of his nature, and it got him killed in the worst way imaginable.
The final image that haunts me, the one that I can call up with perfect clarity, isn't the face in the window or the dent in my truck. It's the memory of its silhouette as it came around the side of the cabin, running on 2 legs under the moonlight. It was a shape of impossible biology, a living contradiction. And the most terrifying part, the part that keeps me awake at night, is the certainty that it is still out there, moving through the silent, dark places of the world. And it remembers.